Hey, we're going to be going live in just a minute here. And let's get started. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Systemic Foundations of Family Therapy. This is definitely one of the, I think, most difficult topics in all of psychotherapy and every single discipline: psychology, counseling, social work, MFT. All of them include on their licensing exams systemic theories. Certainly the MFT exam, this is most of what you get. And after being a textbook author in counseling and psychotherapy and family therapy theories for over 2 decades, I can tell you these are the hardest concepts, hands down. And so what I'm going to do today is to go over the fundamental kind of philosophical foundations of the systemic therapies, which are really the foundation in particular for systemic family therapies, of which there are many. And if you are in a field of counseling and psychology, you kind of learn these kind of together as a group. If you're in the field of MFT, you will be typically learning many very specific, forms of systemic therapy, like, Milan systemic therapy, MRI, structural, Satir, Bowen, but all of these different theories really are grounded in some just counterintuitive. If there's anything about systems, it is very counterintuitive, and that is why it is so difficult to grasp these theories, because they're just very, very, I think, different than most of us think on a daily basis. That said, systemic theories are definitely leaders in evidence-based treatments for very difficult to treat conditions. So what is so important, regardless of how you are licensed, if you're practicing any form of professional counseling, psychotherapy, family therapy, the more complex your cases, the more critical it is that you understand these systemic concepts. Because when, just using more traditional psychotherapy approaches, especially individual approaches, don't work, aren't getting you the results you would expect, there's almost always a systemic issue, systemic issue going on. And there probably could also be some kind of biological, medical issue going on. But systemic therapies, the more difficult and chronic the case or the symptoms, the more likely it is that you're going to be needing systemic theories or systemic thinking to help you address what's going on. So the research has found the more difficult and severe the condition is, the more people you need to have in that room to address what's going on. So super excited to be doing this here today. And for those of you, this is getting recorded live. If you're here live, please in the chat, go ahead and put your name and where you're joining us from, and just say a quick hello. And as we are going along, for those of you who are here while I'm recording this live, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and I will do my best to answer those. Awesome. So we've got folks from Sam from Virginia. Sophia's here, Catherine in Virginia, Andrea in Missouri, Kim in Minnesota, Ashley from San Antonio, Luciana in Georgia, Hillsboro, Oregon, Sarah, Stephanie from Michigan, Vancouver, Virginia, San Francisco, Texas, Nebraska, New York, California, Woodland Hills, very close to me, Rhode Island, love it. California, Texas, great to have everyone here. Great to have you here. British Columbia, love it. Oklahoma, Vietnam, okay, Las Vegas, LA, Baton Rouge, Norway, love it. Maryland, Agoura Hills, oh my goodness, you're down the road from me. New York, awesome. Great to have everyone here. So excited. Connecticut, okay. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So let's just start at the beginning. So systems theory really began as an interdisciplinary area of study. Philosophy is not quite the right words, and it really began with a series of conferences called the Macy Conferences, which brought together, rocket engineers, anthropologists, people working in biological sciences, and they met with Macy's department store supporting these conferences. There's a series of them in the mid part of the 20th century. And they were noticing that groups of things seem to operate with certain principles, like ecological systems, right? Mechanical systems, like self-guided missiles, right? They come from actually the Macy conferences in terms of how they self-correct. And they also noticed that social systems, these groups of things, both some of them mechanical and some living and humans, that these different groups of things seem to operate with a certain set of principles that are the same across all of these different disciplines, which is really kind of fascinating when you think about it. And Gregory Bateson was at these conferences. He was an anthropologist. He was the husband of Margaret Mead, another very famous anthropologist. And out of these conferences, he talked a lot about cybernetic theory. We'll talk about cybernetics, but I'll define it quickly. Cybernetics is about self-correcting systems. So these are systems that can self-correct. So self-guided missiles self-correct, right? And so they were looking at that with the self-guided missiles and noticing that, biological systems do this. If you look at if you remember the predator and prey cycle, right? How they're kind of keep each other in balance in a given ecosystem, right? There's a self-correction. So if you have too much prey or too many predators, those systems self-correct. And they noted, Gregory Bateson was studying different tribal groups in New Guinea and Bali, and noticed that even the interactions between these tribes in terms of how they escalated and even handled war at a tribal level, there was like this self-correction where it never got taken to an extreme. And so this is where the things that this is kind of where systems comes into psychology. And Gregory Bateson, there was a team called the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto near Stanford, and they were studying families with a member who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and trying to understand these families. And Gregory Bateson was consulted by the MRI team. And this is where cybernetics kind of came into the field of mental health. And so there was also another thinker, more than a therapist, Heinz von Forster, who was studying physics, right? And so he also contributed to figuring out how to take these cybernetic, models and theories about systems and understanding how self-correction is governing human interaction. And so other thinkers early in the field were Milton Ericson. He was a psychiatrist. He's the only one so far we've talked about who is a mental health professional. Actually, he was an MD. But Milton Ericson was famous for creating these brief, rapid interventions that were very creative. And in fact, now his work is continued through what we call Ericksonian hypnosis. You may have heard of this. And so it's his own kind of unique form of hypnosis. And so Milton Erickson's work is very influential, both in what we call the classic systems family therapies, but as well as solution-focused therapy. And if you've ever tried to deliver the miracle question and it didn't work, I can tell you it is because you were not taught how to do it with, I'm not going to say you're putting people into hypnosis when you do solution-based therapies, but there's a subtlety in how you use your language, how it needs to be worded. And I think that is directly influenced by Ericksonian hypnosis. As someone who's tried to supervise in this area, there's a particular way you deliver things that really helps people entertain and see new possibilities. And I think good solution-focused therapists are drawing on this just a little bit. Then you have the incredible power team at the MRI Institute, and they're really, I think, the ones who are most regularly credited for taking these cybernetic ideas and putting them into a usable psychotherapy, family therapy, couple therapy approach. So you have Don Jackson, Paul Václavic, Richard Fish, Janet Bevan, Alan Watts, who's actually, you might know him if you know any Buddhist literature. He's actually a Western person who brought in some Buddhist and Zen concepts. So there's a tiny bit of Zen Buddhism in systems approaches as well. And then, of course, Ericson. And their first book was called Pragmatics of Human Communication. It is a book that if you're interested in the history of family therapy, that's really definitely where to start. And then Brad Keeney was actually a student of Bateson and continued Bateson's work around cybernetics in the field of family therapy, but talking about what they call second order cybernetics, which I will define in just a minute for you, but kind of moving those thoughts forward. Lots of really important thinkers, and this just gives you a sense of some of the early ones. So one of the most basic things to begin with here is that this is concept of general systems theory. Okay, so this was also talked about at the Macy's conferences. There was general systems theory. There was also cybernetics. Both of these are influential in the field of mental health, and especially in what we call the systemic family therapies generally. And the first concept here is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so this is applied to, self-guided missiles, ecosystems, as well as, in this case, social systems and family systems. So the whole, the family, is bigger than just the collection of its members, and that the family itself is organized in a way, it has a type of quote unquote mind, not like a brain-based mind, but a logic and a meaning-making system all of its own. And another concept in general systems theories is that these systems are organized. They're not randomly put together, and there's often hierarchy. There are subsystems working together, and we certainly see these concepts played out in structural family therapy, which I talk about in a different video. One of the interesting concepts here in general systems theories is that systems strive for self-preservation, meaning that the individuals in a system, especially like a family system, they're working not just for self-preservation, typically, but also for the preservation of the system itself. And so obviously there are exceptions where people grow up and decide to, cut off from their families, but the nature of a system is to want to stay together as much as possible. And certainly as a family therapist, the most people will say that they still want some kind of connection. They want it to not be abusive, obviously, but this drive to connect and to keep the system alive. And then there's also the distinction between what they call an open system and closed system. It's often useful to think of these when we're talking about humans. Mechanically, these are kind of black and white, but with humans, open systems just means that you connect with other systems beyond yourself, right? And there's a free flow of information from the outside to the inside. So an open system has a lot of back and forth with the environment. Closed systems limit any connection with the outside. And so generally there's a healthy middle, and there's a wide range of ways of kind of finding a healthy balance between an open versus a closed system in families. This is often culturally informed, and there are just many ways to find a healthy balance in that. But obviously either extreme is not good. If a family system is too open, there are too many outside members kind of intermixing, the boundaries get very, very blurry. And if it's too rigid on the other side, there's not enough contact with the outside, it can become a kind of an unhealthy rigidity to that system. So two concepts that are associated with systems theories is the concept of equifinality and equipotentiality. So, and this is just about, it highlights the lack of predictability in systems. So equifinality means that a single end state can have many possible causes. And so just because, for example, you see a particular type of symptom, let's say a depressed teenager, there are many types of situations that could lead to that teenager having depressed symptoms. You can't know for sure. Conversely, equipotentiality is that a single cause can have many potential outcomes. So if you have a parent who has, let's say, an authoritarian parenting style, you can have many possible outcomes. You could end up with a highly rebellious child. Another child might end up highly compliant. So you can have lots of different types of outcomes from a given cause. So it reminds us as clinicians that we can't accurately predict what the system is going to do. And so you just helps think of it as keeping you humble as well. So equifinality, many things to a single final ending. Equipotentiality, that there's a single cause, there can be many potentials from a single, input into a system. So circular causality. This is truly at the heart of, I think, great therapy, period, end of sentence, great professional counseling, period, end of sentence. Because if you're not able to, whether you're working with an individual, couple, or family, understand how that person is interacting with their environment. And sometimes this circular causality is even within our own heads, especially with things like anxiety and OCD. But understanding circular causality is, I think, the hardest thing and the most counterintuitive, because from a subjective experience, it never looks like we are in a dance with someone else. It looks like they are causing me a problem or making me happy, whatever it might be, but the outside is causing what I'm feeling. And this is just not how humans perceive reality. And so this is the part that really is the hardest part to grasp. But when you really begin to get this, doing this work becomes so much easier. So basically, circular causality really requires you to avoid simplistic explanations, like there's one directional cause or linear causality. Because that parent is authoritarian, right? This child is, is oppositional defiant or something along those lines. This, you don't get to use simple explanations. It just feels so good. It just feels so good to have a simple linear causality. But when you're looking at humans, oftentimes both within them, intrapsychically as well as interpersonally, keeping the circular causality in mind adds a lot of complexity to how you're conceptualizing, but it makes your conceptualizations much more accurate. So, so systemic therapists are always looking about how the interaction pattern between people in the system are mutually reinforcing each other's behavior. So when a parent, let's say, is authoritarian, you have the one kid who it might be talking back, becoming defiant, and you have another one who's probably running off and becoming more compliant, right? And you create this dance and how they all interact in the system. And you might have another parent who's like pretending like they don't hear or see anything, right? So you have this whole dance. No one's necessarily orchestrating it all. Now, sometimes if there's an abuse, if there's one person has more power, there can be one person may have less influence in this circular interacting cycle. But how, regardless, of that, how one person responds to, let's say you have an authoritarian parent who is, overusing their authority, right? You can have one kid who's defiant, who's going to get a very different response out of that parent. You can have another child who becomes overly compliant, gets a different response out of that, parent. And even though there's a power difference, you're looking and trying to understand how those interaction patterns happen. For example, and looking at couples where there, may not as often is there a power imbalance, just how one person's, the way that they ask for connection, right? And oftentimes, unfortunately, that takes the form of nagging. But behind that nagging is a desire to, get reconnect emotionally. And the other person can withdraw from that because they feel overwhelmed. They feel like they're being criticized. And so they can create a very unhappy pattern. And trust me, if you talk to either person in that nag withdrawal cycle, one of them is, I only nag because they withdraw, but I only withdraw because they nag. And for each person, their reality is so real. They really cannot, it's hard to believe and see how they're inadvertently, unintentionally reinforcing this negative pattern. And so systemic clinicians have real compassion for the subjective reality is that my partner or the other person is causing it, right? Certainly if you have kids, if you have more than one child, it seems like half of parenting for the first 10 years is like, they started, and no, she started, he started, no, they started, right? It's always how it feels, and so oftentimes when I'm doing couples therapy, well, I don't start this. It's only because you do, but I don't do that because you do that, So even with couples, you'll see it. You certainly see this most clearly, I think, with kids. But the truth is that is just human nature. And so how we subjectively experience all of this. So moving on, there is cybernetic theory, and cybernetic theory is a form of systemic theory, right? And it really focuses on, conceptualizes what you're observing by looking at the homeostatic concept of homeostasis and the concept of self-correction. And so cybernetics are looking about how systems maintain a sense of balance, of norm, because they must constantly self-correct. So in a family, socially, even intrapsychically, we all have homeostatic patterns as individuals, couples, families, social systems, groups. Any group has a homeostasis. But this is a unique set of behaviors that are just considered normal, emotions, interaction norms that are considered normal. And so the way a family homeostasis actually ends up kind of getting created is when the couple first gets together, unintentionally, without any deliberate, right, interactions, there is this set of relationship norms. How often do we communicate? What does that look like? What are the rules for touch? What are the rules for how we repair when things go wrong? So all of that, what type of emotions are expressed in this relationship? And eventually that expands to the family. And so there's a set of norms. And if you have ever been in a long-term relationship and went to go meet your partner's family of origin, you will notice there's so many little quirky things that are very different across families, and even from within the same cultural group, religious group, social economic group, even across, when there's so many similarities, individual families have their own homeostasis, their own sets of norms, how emotions are supposed to be talked about and expressed, what is acceptable, what is not, who can talk when, all of that is the family homeostasis, okay? So, and it's always fluid, it's kind of moving. And so that is what the, so this concept of morphogenesis is how the system is still kind of even changing and moving if you think of your family, but there's still a certain level of homeostasis. So it's constantly changing to maintain that homeostasis if you think across the lifespan, right? So the self-correcting process, right? These feedback loops, and so the morphostasis is the self-correcting to help remain stable. So what happens is we get feedback loops as to whether or not the behavior is acceptable or within the normal limits of acceptable behavior. There's a whole range, right? Because you're going to have how you handle a celebration, how you handle problems. There's a whole range of behaviors and emotions within the family norm. And so the cybernetics is looking at this tension between changing to help maintain stability, and this whole thing between stability and you have to constantly be changing. If you can think of this, if you try to stand on one foot, right, to create balance on one foot, you have to constantly move to maintain standing on one foot. So to maintain homeostasis always requires this type of balancing act moving on top. So the key words here, and those of you who end up taking the national MFT licensing exam, you better know the difference between negative and positive feedback, because this is definitely going to be on your exam. And this is a little bit tricky, which is why it's on your exam. And California MFT, you might find this on your exam as well. Two real important concepts. So what is self-correction? How does the system self-correct? There's negative feedback and there's positive feedback. And you have to think of the medical test where negative feedback is kind of good, positive feedback is bad. This is why they put it on every test. So if you think of negative feedback means the behaviors are within the system's set of acceptable norms. Again, there's a whole range, right? How families celebrate, how they show love, how they handle problems. But there's a range of normal behaviors that a system has. And negative feedback is just like, yep, we're kind of within our range of normal behaviors. Positive feedback is bad. It's like getting a positive medical test, right? Not a good thing usually. If you're thinking of like a COVID test, right? A positive result means you are positive, you have COVID, not what you want. So the positive is a crisis situation. It's an escalation. It means that some of the behavior within the system has gone outside of the acceptable norms. There is an alert. There is a certain sense of danger. Oh my God, there's a panic. We need to do something different. We need to get back to normal, right? If you've studied internal family systems theory, they talk about the managers they use systems theories to look at our intra-psychic life. And you have managers who are just maintaining homeostasis. So when there's negative feedback, you have the managers just kind of keeping the system going. And when there is positive feedback, the firefighters come out, and they're the ones who are the crisis, trying to get everything back to normal, to what's considered safe and normal intrapsychically for all of us. So all these concepts you can apply to your inner world as well as your outer world. And that is what they do in internal family systems. So positive feedback, remember the firefighters, negative feedback or the managers. Yep, everything's going according to plan. We keep this normal. So when there is positive feedback, the system goes into crisis, and many members of the system, maybe not all, but many people in the system will be working very hard to get things back to normal, and they may use more extreme measures to do that. And so there usually is, there can be a threat. So when someone, for example, someone, let's say, who is threatening, if you think of the borderline behavior, there might be a threat of harm to self to try to get someone's attention. That is because they perceive there is this positive escalation, and they will do something more dramatic to try to get things back to normal. So that's the difference between negative and positive feedback. Which brings us to first and second order change. Again, a very, very commonly occurring topic on licensing exams, especially the national MFT licensing exam. So first order change is something that's, clinicians use to describe what they're seeing. So in first order change, the roles simply shift. So let's say you have a couple, and let's say it was a heterosexual couple, and the wife was pursuing for closeness and the man was withdrawing, right? You had this dance between them. Let's say therapist comes in, starts doing some systemic therapy, and all of a sudden, or even an individual therapist, this actually is one that individual therapists can do. You might just be working with let's say you're working with a wife individually, you get her to stop pursuing, and then all of a sudden, the husband starts pursuing her. Let's say you have that dynamic. So you're working with her individually, you see the pattern, and you have her stop pursuing. And then within a couple of weeks, all of a sudden, the husband is suddenly pursuing her, right? And she's probably actually doing a little withdrawing herself. Now, that would be a first order change. Now, to the people in that system, it is night and day, dramatically different. But from a systemic perspective, all you've done is switched roles in first order change. You have each individual member of the family is doing something very different. But let's say their capacity for mutual intimacy and empathy may not have changed at all. Their roles are just different. And so typically, clinicians are looking for second order change unless the system just needed some roles switched, which can happen, is less common. But second order change is when you truly create a new homeostasis that is significantly different than the one they came in with. So you're not just switching roles out, right? But instead, what you are doing is you're, for example, either having clearer boundaries, you're increasing their ability for emotional or physical intimacy. You are somehow truly changing the structure of the system. So what they consider normal behavior, the homeostasis has truly changed. In first order change, the homeostatic patterns and behaviors are pretty much the same. In second order, there is a whole new normal set of behaviors that define the interactions in the system. So second order change is usually what clinicians are going through, but it's not always necessary. It depends on the client situation. So I'm just trying to think of, there might be some couples or families who are coming in with pretty mild situations, and they don't need a huge restructuring. They just need some, maybe getting through a temporary phase. And the truth is, in real life, the distinction between first and second order change are less clear. 1.5 order change is a pretty normal. Sometimes you're like, is that really restructured? It really does depend on the family, but the concept here is, the take-home message is, when you're watching your clients, especially if you're looking at couples and families, you want to make sure that it's not just that roles have flipped and different people are doing different things. Like, it's very common to have it, let's say you're working with a child, even individually or as part of a family, and you get the problem child fixed. All of a sudden, the child who was the good or perfect child suddenly spirals out of control. Very, very common when you're working with kids and in family work. And so that should be a huge red flag. You need second order change. First order change is not enough in that system. And that if the one kid who is quote unquote the presenting problem, the problem child, the bad one, it's just the kid, it's not the family, the rest of the family, we're fine. If you get that kid functional and the other one spirals, then you totally need second order change in that scenario. Okay, so this is critical to understand if you ever work with couples and families to survive those sessions. Usually, when you work with couples and families, you can get into a lot of trouble if you're not distinguishing the report and command aspect of communication, even more so than when you're working with individuals. So the report element of the communication is the content. So this, if you can think of this, you're trained hopefully to do this in your first year of graduate school, to distinguish the content from the process. And so report and command is getting at that content and process distinction that we teach clinicians, mental health clinicians, to attend to when you're first learning to do this work. So the report is what the clients are saying, but the command is the meta communication. It's telling the other person how to communicate, how to interpret the content that they're speaking. And it almost always has some kind of comment about the status of the relationship or the quality of the relationship, like who's in charge, who's, the power dynamics in that relationship, how you feel or care about somebody. So when you're working with couples or families or individuals who are complaining about their partners or other people in their life, any human talking about communication with another human, which all of us do with all of our clients, you always want to sort out what was the communication, what's the content, but what is the meta communication? What does this communication say about the relationship? How does it define who each person's role in the system? And what is that about? So, for example, if you have, let's say, one partner asks the other one to take out the trash, sounds like an innocent enough communication, but there can be many different forms of meta communication that are attached to that, which then can spiral into, obviously, arguments. And you're always like, how do couples end up, arguing about trash cans and toothpaste lids at such a ferocious way? It's because of how they felt the meta communication that they picked up from the other person during this kind of innocuous content going on. So whenever you had, especially if you're sitting there with a couple and you're watching them like arguing about, I don't know, who was running late for a dinner the other night, and what that, it's the meta communication that they're arguing about. So you always want to take those seemingly ridiculous content things, especially with couples and families, but they might be arguing about, and then listening for what is it that you heard your partner say, what was implied about this relationship based on that comment. So this report and command leads us to one of the I think earliest really clear theories and contributions in family therapy, which is understanding the double bind. So double blind theory, you'll even hear it referred to that. So, and this was the research at the MRI Institute and relying very heavily on the work of Bateson, where they define a double bind as there are two people in an intense relationship that has high survival value. So typically this is a couple relationship, a parenting relationship, or a very close friendship where you two, it's not easy to just disconnect and have there be no consequence. And what happens is there is a primary injunction or command, and then a secondary one that contradicts the first, right? And so oftentimes this is the secondary one is nonverbal, and that's how the communication can be, how that can even make sense. So oftentimes, one of the classic examples when they were studying families with a schizophrenic member, they noticed there would often be something like the mother comes in, goes to hug the child, and but the child goes to hug the mother, and the mother kind of stiffens up, in that interaction, and then says, and then 2 minutes later says, why don't you ever, show me affection or love? And it's just like, but I did, but you non-verbally didn't want it, but verbally you say you want it. Or the parent who says, I want you to, I trust you. I just don't, I'm just not going to let you do X, Y, and Z because I don't trust your friends, but you're still not trusting me around my friends, right? Or the partner, another common one is, you'll see this fairly often in heterosexual relationships, where, the female might be saying, I want you to be romantic, in therapy usually, right? And then, I want you to be more romantic. You never do anything romantic for me. So the next week, they come back to therapy, and the husband's like, I did a nice romantic dinner. I cooked dinner. There were candlelight. I made dinner for her, this, that, the other. And then she says, well, you only did that because I told you to. So that's a double bind. And he's like, so what do I do? And systemic therapists have an answer for that. Oh, that double bind situation. And I think a lot of what we call gaslighting today can have elements of this double bind where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. No matter what you do, it's kind of flipped around. So obviously double binds are really bad psychologically for the receiver. And so the early theory here and with around schizophrenia is that oftentimes when you're caught, if you're constantly caught in a series of these double binds, then one of the most sane things you can do is to attempt to not communicate. Because if no matter what you say, it gets flipped against you, try not to communicate. So, which is impossible. You cannot not communicate, but you can try. So it's a really unhealthy type of interaction patterns. And most of us will do a little bit of this to some degree in a lot of our relationships. A lot of people, my students, when I use the example of the romantic, asking for romantic things, but as soon as someone does it because they ask, because you had to tell them to do it, it doesn't count anymore. They're like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. It's not good. Okay. Not good in relationships to do that. So some other concepts that systemic, folks use, and this comes directly out of the work of Bateson, is a distinction between symmetrical and complementary relationships. And this can be really helpful, particularly when you're looking at either couples or siblings, so symmetrical relationships sound great because there's this equality there. And so a lot of couples today try to strive for symmetrical relationships. The problem is that it's much easier to escalate in terms of conflict, because each one, is trying to win. Or in complementary relationships, each one has a distinct role that is complementary to the other. Their roles don't overlap. And so what happens with complementary relationships, there can be a lot less conflict. So in traditional couple relationships, typically it's very complementary, maybe the breadwinner and the homemaker is a very traditional, classic, complementary relationship. They are more stable. They typically argue less if if that's what they both want. However, as those roles become more and more polarized and rigid, you can have that polarity. What ends up happening is it really begins to look like the systemic system or personality characteristics. And so you often see this, let's say, again, in heterosexual relationships where one partner is very feeling, typically the female, the other one's very logical, typically the male. And over time, and I work with hundreds of couples like this, where after 10, 20 years of these labels getting more and more rigid, more and more polarized, right? They begin to believe that only the woman is having emotions and only the man's being logical, each from their own perspective, right? But it's really not personality characteristics, because all of us have parts of us that are logical, parts of us that are emotional. But if you're in a system where one person gets to do all the emotion, the other one gets to does all the logic, and you do that for 20 years, you begin to believe that's who you are. But it's not who you are. It's the homeostasis of this system and who you have become in this relationship. And so that is why understanding these types of subtleties can be so important, whether you're working with individuals, couples, or families, because even the people in the system begin to define themselves based on systemic dynamics, not something that's actually about who they are. And they can get, in the more polarized people, the roles get in a system, the more the more likely and the more rigid the system becomes, and the less able it is to respond to environmental, everyday life stressors, big stressors, little stressors, any stressors. So health in a system is typically characterized by a lot of flexibility in the roles of the members. So you can think of it this way: if you have a couple where only one of them does all the cooking, the other one does all the dishes, that's very complementary, it's very stable. However, let's say the person who normally cooks or pays the bills, whoever that person is, suddenly can't do it anymore. You have chaos in that system, where if both members can pay the bills, can take care of kids, can get food, prepare food, you have a system that is much more flexible and able to handle whatever life throws at you. So this is true both internally and with our relationship systems. So some of the defining features of the family as a system is, so systemic therapists view a family as a whole-on, meaning it's an entity in and of itself. It's almost like it's an organism, and the early literature will refer to the family as a type of organism. It is bigger than the sum of its parts, right? And there's almost like a mind, but the mind is what's happening between, there's a logic to the system. They use the word mind, and Bateson used the word mind quite a bit to describe these. But there is this whole logic to a system that functions a lot like a mind, that's not controlled by any individual, but that there's a huge force. And if you can think of your family and their traditions, right? There is a logic to them. And right now we're coming up on the holiday season as this is being filmed live. And so, how your family might be doing a holiday like Thanksgiving, or Christmas or Hanukkah, those sorts of holidays. There's these rules, right? And it's almost like a gravitational force, how that is supposed to be done. And that's kind of the sense of what they're talking about. And that there's no single person typically orchestrating these interactional patterns, although some can have more influence than others, and there can be abuse in these, with one having more power than others. But another maxim they have is this idea that all behavior makes sense in context. And when you believe this at the depths of your soul and your being, that all human behavior makes sense in a particular context, you just need to understand the client's meaning-making system. It really helps you to be a more compassionate an understanding clinician, because all behavior makes sense. And when you finally understand a person's life experience and how they see things, how they interpret things, it will make sense. Now, this last one has kind of morphed a bit, but in general, outside of severe abuse situations, that no single person can be blamed for the family relational distress. That there is, and obviously some will have more influence in that than others. Typically, parents always usually have a lot more influence than their children. But certainly, the family, how all members interact with each other, they have co-created to a certain extent, the interaction pattern that they have. So I always the example I like to remember, you can have an authoritarian parent, right, who's using too much authority in unhealthy ways, but you can have one kid who is defiant in response to that, the other who's overly compliant. Another one could become highly focused on high achieving. You can have many different outcomes. And so it's not the authoritarian parent didn't cause that defiance, that it was the interaction between those two folks and how the child received it. Because some kids with authoritarian parents become wildly successful, okay? Others become wildly unsuccessful. And so understanding that all of those are possibilities because they interacted, and just because you have an authoritarian parent, you don't know exactly what is going to happen to the child, that there is a reciprocal process that happens. And so, and also realizing that any personality characteristics, are shaped by the system. So let's say you have an extrovert who starts dating an extrovert. One of those parties is probably going to be more of an introvert in that particular relationship. Or if you're in another relationship where you might have an extrovert with an introvert, the extrovert who is more introverted with their extrovert partner, right, becomes, so that's, I think you get a sense if you look at all your different relationships, friendships, right, who you are in those contexts shifts, but depending on who you're in relationship with and the norms at each of those relationships, and how you kind of get shaped by those interaction patterns. And no one's controlling it all. But realizing when we're seeing our clients, it's not necessarily this innate, they just are who they are, it's biology causing it all. There's this whole other level of all of these social systems of which we are part and how they affect the individual. And so that is why when clients aren't responding to an individual conceptualization of their problem with more severe and chronic cases, there's almost always a systemic dynamic going on that's affecting that particular person and their symptoms. You'll hear family therapists talk a lot about epistemology as well. And epistemology is a study of knowledge and the process of knowing. So how do we know what we know? And Bateson was really looking at how so many of the propositions that we take to assume to be true are often erroneous, like feeling like your partner can control you. At a certain extent, they can't literally control you, right? But it feels like that. And that's often how we talk about relationships. And people can have more influence over it, but there isn't the possibility to literally directly control. And a lot of these propositions appear to be very true because they are capturing one half of that, complex dynamic. So there are always elements of all these propositions that are true, right? And so if you think of someone being able to control another person, I always, Viktor Frankl, we all talk about this incredible individual who went through just horrifying experiences during the Holocaust, in concentration camps, and yet at the end of it, he was able in his mind to still maintain a sense of freedom, right? Remarkable human being. And so this is kind of what they're trying to capture here. So when you're working with a couple or a family, they have their own little epistemology. You want to understand how they come up with the things that they assume to be true about themselves and others and members of their family, what's possible, what's not, what to expect from kids, what to expect from our partners. And And so there's a lot of these very kind of underlying assumptions about life, looking at how families shape these assumptions in ways that we're really not conscious of, families and partners, relationships. And then finally, towards, as systems theories evolved over time, the late 20th century now, most of what we talked about was more mid-20th century, was the concept of second order cybernetics. Okay. And this is when they realized, oh my God, all these principles we're applying to couples and families, we're doing the same thing as a therapist between us and our client. And so all of these dynamics, the norms in a system, in a relational system, in the therapeutic system is a system just like any other system. And we create this homeostasis. If you're familiar with the work of Salvador Minuchin, and he talked about joining a system, and a lot of both Salvador Minuchin and also like the Milan team, the MRI team, the early family therapists would say you get 2 to 3 weeks where you can sort of see the family system clearly in session. And then after that, the two of you have created another second order system, a second order cybernetics, and you are shaping them. And when you think about this, right, last time you went into a therapy session, how natural were you? Not so much. No one's natural in therapy. We have to remember this, right? Especially in the beginning. But the therapist actually is the one who creates a lot of the norms and the homeostasis of that therapeutic relationship in session. And so what second order cybernetics says is that we, as the clinician, are shaping the behavior we're seeing in our clients right in front of us, because we are also part of a system. So ethically, second order cybernetics is very, very important, because we're creating a second order system, and we're the more powerful person and the more influential person in that system. And so one of the things that second order cybernetic therapists pointed out was that our descriptions of our clients, whether we're talking about homeostasis or boundaries or interpsychic processes, all of that's coming from our worldview, not the client's. We are taking our jargon, our vocabulary, our systems of assessment, whether it's the DSM or systemic or whatever theory you're using, we're imposing that on the client. So what we're seeing is a reflection of our own thinking systems. It's not genuinely what the client is experiencing. And so being aware of this. So yes, we do have professional knowledge that is useful and can help us to be useful. They are the tools of our trade. But what second order cybernetics reminds us is that we have to remember all of these things, these boundaries, these hierarchies, these norms, right? These diagnoses that we are seeing is a product of our world, that we are filtering what they're saying through it. And so it really invites you to take a much more humble perspective. And so realizing how you interact with your clients significantly impacts how they are behaving. So you're shaping their behavior. So when I train clinicians, I have them that I call the therapist song and dance, where we introduce, informed consent. I think how you handle that is one of the most important things you do, because you are setting the culture for the room. And I think it's so important to, oftentimes therapists are like, well, this is my legal duty, so I'm going to talk like this and make it really serious and scary what they're saying. And when you do that, though, you are shaping the therapeutic system from that position. And I think, I really work hard to have that be a very down-to-earth, open, relaxed. I make it usually, I try to add, I have a couple jokes, standard jokes I put into that. Because you are shaping this therapeutic system and you're the person who's influencing it the most. And the first thing we do always is that informed consent. Which brings us to one of the things that they talk a lot about in cybernetic work, which is drawing a distinction, what they call punctuating, right? When you punctuate in family systems, what they're talking about, you are the one drawing a distinction, the pursuer versus the distancer, right? And again, this is reflecting our worldview. And so hopefully it's going to be useful to the client, these distinctions, these professional distinctions that we create, right? Attachment, for example, is a professional distinction we make. And you want to be very aware, though, even if you're using that tool, that tool is not the truth. It is not the essence of what is going on. It is our distinction that we have constructed to try to be helpful, knowing that it may not always be helpful in the ways that we intend, and we have to be always attending to that. And so whenever you draw a distinction, you're describing, any word we use is a distinction, right? And that there's a certain arbitrariness to it, and it's always dividing a system into multiple parts. So when you describe, good behavior, bad behavior, you have, you have this dividing line that you have created, and to be conscious of that and to notice the effects of any word or distinction that you are using. So this is why systemic therapists, try to not use diagnostic language, like ADHD or major depressive disorder, and you'll see this also in the postmodern therapies as well, because those distinctions carry a whole other, package of meaning with them that can make it harder to change that behavior with the individual or with the systems. So they're very careful in choosing words, and even as you choose a label as as something good versus bad, it has a lot of implications, because you're always pointing to whatever that other side, that other half of the distinction might be, whether you're giving voice to it or not. And so this means that systemic therapists, you also see this in the postmodern therapists, are very, very thoughtful about the choice of words that they use to ensure that both, that distinction is the best distinction, the most useful distinction for this client to think about their situation through. And finally, just to kind of wrap up, what is the spirit? One of the things I think that's often very much misunderstood, you will see that there's a certain amount of sometimes playfulness or irreverence. They are not flustered easily, systemic therapists, especially when you watch traditional systemic therapists. It's some people are a little, oh my God, why aren't they more worried? This is psychosis. We've got to this is horrible. This is terrible. We got to panic. Well, maybe not panic, but we need to go get to hospital and med, right? You'll notice that there is a certain amount of, no matter how severe the symptom is, obviously systemic therapists take action to keep people safe. They get people the proper treatment, but you'll notice they're not as flustered as a more traditionally trained clinician, and they're not intimidated by serious problems, because they see it is embedded within a systemic dynamic, and they actually have more hope. It sounds kind of strange because they don't see it all as like the worst pathology in the world is happening here. This is, terrible that this person is so severe. They actually get curious. They're like, I wonder why this behavior makes sense in this family. Why would why would this be? They get very curious because they're curious about how the system has organized around this particular behavior. So there's a ton of compassion. There's a ton of respect when systemic therapists are working. They do take care of crises, but they're not freaked out by severe symptoms the way I think most of us were trained to in some ways. Because the way they see it is, and you will certainly see this when you look at the strategic and systemic therapies themselves, they don't go in and they, maybe have this family with this problematic behavior pattern. They don't go in and try to correct the system. They really do trust that what they're going to do is just, they're just going to draw some new distinctions, punctuate things differently. They're going to just poke at the system. And the best metaphor I've ever seen for this is if you ever been in a large aquarium, and where I saw this first was in the Monterey Bay Aquarium in Northern California. Beautiful, beautiful place. If you ever get to Monterey, you should go there. And there was a school of silver sardines, beautiful fish swimming in this huge 3-4 story tank, right? It's a huge kelp forest is what they call it. You can even you can Google kelp cam because you can check out the kelp forest, but you'll see there's always at least one big school of sardines, several hundred fish swimming in this gorgeous pattern, right? Then every once in a while, like a rockfish will come swimming through the middle of this school of fish, and the sardines scatter. They'll go all over the place. They get totally disorganized, right? Positive feedback loop. But within a minute, after the rockfish messes up their beautiful little dance in one section of the tank, all of the sardines have recoalesced in a different homeostasis on another part of the tank. And that's basically what system therapies are doing. They're not trying to micromanage, who's got what role in the system. They're more just poking at a system, poking at it, disrupting the homeostasis, often in a not very logical way, because they know that the system, they trust the system. They trust the system. Because what happens is when you can't do your normal homeostasis, you have to make a different choice. And oftentimes you'll end up making a more conscious and better choice when you reorganize, because they know that you don't want to get into a tug of war or an arm wrestle a system, because you're going to always lose as a clinician if you're going to try to arm wrestle a system. You always lose. And this is what I am thankful that these therapists have taught us, because sometimes you can psychoeducate families to change, but most of us have been doing this for a while. That is a minority, not the majority of clients who will come to us. It is oftentimes, and this is what the beauty of what systemic therapies do, is they teach you how to work. And within the system, there's a part that wants that homeostasis is such a powerful force. Even if they want to change, it's very hard to change. And if you've ever tried to go on a diet to lose weight, it's a very similar dynamic. You want to change, but it's really hard to be consistent and make that happen. And that is what is beautiful about these systemic therapies, is they've really figured out how to break through kind of like the gravitational pull of homeostasis and create change from within the system. It's very respectful of changing within. So there is this kind of sometimes puzzling way that they behave. They're always looking at the big picture, and they really do trust the system to reorganize in healthier ways. They see all behavior as a means of communicating, and it makes sense within this system. And that each person, they really do believe each person within the system is doing their best. And so even if we want to, they're doing the best they can with the information they have in that moment. And there is this fundamental respect, even with what the person is doing. It may be harmful, but there's an understanding and a fundamental respect that for whatever reason, this is the behavior that makes the most sense. And usually there's always, a history behind whatever behavior that might be. And so rather than focusing on individual psychopathology, they're really looking at how everyone's coming together in this system to create a dance, and how to work with the system and its norms, its values, and to just kind of poke and prod at it to change things up a little bit. They'll do things like prescribe the symptom. You'll hear that a lot, right? You can do that with prescribing a person to worry for 15 minutes a day, or prescribing a couple to argue for 15 minutes a day. And the reason you do that, and the reason it works, and the reason it is a systemic idea here, is we're taking your symptom and we're just putting it in a different context, because you're saying your worrying is uncontrollable, your arguing is uncontrollable. Well, let's put it in a context where you control it and you have to sit down and worry. And it is an intervention that can be very, very helpful in kind of helping someone figure out how to shift that homeostasis, but from within their own perspective. So, and so they're always just looking at how individual, couple, and family behavior is embedded in these larger systems that have meaning. They have very high kind of pressure for those homeostatic norms to behave in certain ways, and really understanding how hard it is to change when a system's homeostasis is working against you. So yeah, and this is happening, individually and within our own minds, in our couple relationships, family relationships, extended family, our communities, every culture has its own set of homeostatic norms as well. And so, okay, so I hope this has been a good introduction here so far to family systems. And let's see, I'm just wondering if I got any live questions that have come in here. And I am, yeah, so, okay, so now actually what I am going to do is to move on to the postmodern approaches. So here I'm going to talk about the philosophical foundations of postmodern therapies, which we typically think of as solution-focused, narrative, and collaborative therapy, and to talk a little bit about how these, the philosophical foundations and how this grew out of systemic family therapies. So, now, if you are studying systems therapy, you read that chapter, those chapters in your textbook, and you get to the postmodern therapies, they all feel really different, right? You're like, oh my God, that's so different. But the truth is, there is an evolution here, and there was just a little boop change in metaphor. But from second order cybernetics to postmodern, it's a very small step. So it really was an evolution of these ideas. And because what happened was in second order cybernetics, it shattered this idea that the therapist is this neutral outside observer seeing the ultimate truth of their client. And it really began to realize that how we are describing our clients are distinctions. We're drawing those distinctions from our theories and our DSM. And so it's a reflection of our thinking, not their lived truth, right? And so it's really the metaphors that end up changing that shift things into a social constructionist framework. But there are some shared assumptions. So the first is that a person's lived reality is relationally constructed. Systemic therapists talk about it in terms of how they reinforce and circular causality. But circular causality is we are creating our reality together. Both ways of thinking really look at how an individual's identity and symptoms are related to the larger social systems that they are a part of. And so this is in both approaches. They just talk about it very differently. In systems, especially traditional family therapy systems, we're going to be talking all about the family, but that systemic concept, applies to their community, their society that they're a part of, their subgroups that they're a part of, right? Their school systems, their work systems. It's just a whole bunch of systems on top of systems. But in family therapy, we talk about the family therapy the most, but the actual theory has all of these different layers. And when you move to postmodernism, they're much more focused on these higher layers and not just the local family of origin layer. Both approaches do a lot of changing one's language and how a problem is described to alter how it is experienced. So they did a lot of reframing in traditional systems work and how an individual's behavior makes sense within the family context. And in postmodern approaches, they do a lot of how they even name the problem, label the problem. They use externalization to see it as separate from you, but they're using language to shift your relationship to the problem in both approaches. And in both approaches, reality is always relational. It is always constructed within a relational context. And so having this very perfect, pristine, clear, neutral, objective outsider perspective is conceptually impossible both within the systemic frames and postmodern frames. Okay. So let's talk about the metaphor shift. So so systems theory looks at family as a system. That is a metaphor. It is a metaphor to describe, help understand. It's a distinction that the clinician is bringing to help understand what they're observing. Where in postmodernism, they switched over to a textual metaphor, right? So they use the metaphor of a narrative and of text and dialogue to describe what they're seeing and how reality is being constructed. So much of the difference between these two schools of therapy really come down to the metaphor that they are using to describe human interactions. So moving into postmodernism here. So one of the things that they will say is that they are skeptical of objective reality. So they're skeptical because it's anything that we define as healthy and normal always has and is always informed by a broader social context. So you can think of it this way, just, simply, most of us are well aware that in various cultures around the world, how much distance between is polite between you and a stranger is wildly different across different cultures and contexts. But when you're in that context, and that's what you live day to day, it's very real to you. This is rude, this is not. And so realizing that so much of what we label as healthy or normal is really from within, is socially constructed, within groups. They talk about, there's Ken Gergen once described reality as being mute, meaning things don't come and experiences don't come with an objective description of their meaning, right? There's no prepackaged meanings. We are always creating that within our various social contexts as to what something means or what it doesn't mean, right? And so you may have something like a chair, right? That may seem like such a neutral, obvious, object. But if you're from a culture that doesn't have a chair like that, it's perceived totally differently. And so just realizing that there isn't some inherent meaning ascribed to anything, that it is constructed by the communities in relationship, that we make sense of what these things mean. This is reminding me in classic Buddhist training, when they were training monks 1,000 years ago, one of the exercises they would use in Tibet was, looking at, you have this concept of a chariot, right? So this was a kind of like a car back then. They had a chariot. So at what point, if you take away the wheels of a chariot, is it still a chariot? If you take away this part of a chariot, is it still a chariot? If you take the chariot apart and have all of its parts laying down, is it still a chariot? At what point does a chariot lose its chariotness, and is no longer considered a chariot, right? And so it kind of just exemplifies how there's a certain point that's pretty arbitrary where we decide when it is a chariot, when it's not a chariot, right? So, and we do this with everything in our world. So chariots are just a very simple example to help you realize like everything. And then when you get into words like, oh my God, so-and-so was mean to me, or that was rude. Wow, that has got 1,400 layers of cultural meaning on top of things like that. Because if we can't even decide when a chair stops being a chair or chariot stops being a chariot, when we start looking at inanimate objects and experiences and giving our labels to that, it really breaks down quickly. So they talk about reality being constructed. So meaning that any truth we have of what is good and what is not, there was a community dialogue. Now, yes, we bring that into our heads, and there's a point where we, within our own minds, even construct meaning, but it's all drawing from the broader social discourses around us. And so there are different schools of postmodernism that look at these different levels, with constructivists looking at what is happening within the human mind, social constructionists looking at what's happening between people, and critical theory looking at what's happening with dominant societal discourses and how those affect the individual. But all of these are looking at how we construct meaning, even within our own head, is highly influenced by our societies that we are a part of. They talk about language being more formative than representative, meaning that we do, as we've said, we construct our reality primarily through language, And they look at how the language we use shapes our experience of reality and how we shape the meaning of the words that we're using. And if you look at, in society, any, words can constantly change meaning, and, depending on how they are used within groups. For example, queer was once a slur used against LGBTQ community, and at a certain point, that went from being a slur to something that an identity that they owned and redefined. And so you have this shift in the meaning of the word queer. You've also seen it shift in the meaning of the word gay over time, right? So all of these, so language is living. It is constantly evolving. And so from a postmodern perspective, they're looking at, society giving us the meaning, but as we talk with our friends and in our communities, we can reshape and change the meaning of words. And so they're conscious of that and using that even in session. So especially when we're looking at how we identify ourselves and how we identify the problem, and you'll see that. For example, in narrative therapy, they very much focus on, they will often use this process of externalizing the problem. So rather than constructing the problem as something that's, within us, something that's part of us, they construct it as the problem is something outside of us. You can have a relationship to this problem, ADHD or depression or whatever it might be. And they found that when you take the problem from being something that you are, an adjective that describes you, or a condition that you have, to this external force, that people had a greater sense of agency when they conceptualized it like that. So you'll see that language is used very skillfully and very intentionally in these approaches. And that is where postmodern approaches are very hard to learn to do well, because it requires this real philosophical shift in how you personally experience reality, and realizing how words shape our experiences in ways we don't consciously recognize typically when it's happening. But there's a real subtlety in how language is used in solution-focused, narrative, and collaborative that's very hard to perceive when you're just watching someone do the work. It's the hardest part of these theories to learn. Another concept they have is that knowledge is a communal achievement. It is not an individual one. And that all of the meanings we develop, especially those even around our identity, we're not just making those up in our heads. It is a communal experience. And if those around you aren't able to see you or define you the way you see yourself, you're going to have a hard time maintaining that identity. So postmodern therapists help clients untangle the dialogues around problems. And so oftentimes when you're working from a postmodern perspective, and let's say recently I was working with I was actually doing training, live supervision around a client with who was blaming themselves related to asexual assault is what was happening. And so, the traditional way to handle that type of thing would be to rush in, and when the client starts blaming themselves, to psychoeducate and tell them, that no, it's not your fault. And there certainly could be a place for that. But where the postmodernist starts, and from a postmodern perspective, what you're going to do first, before you give them your worldview, you're going to be very curious as to where they got those ideas. And, is there a friend? Is there a family? Is it something they've seen or heard, right? Would you feel the same way with your friends? You're looking for how this unique client makes sense of things, and you're tracking these threads, because there's usually multiple relational experiences. And so relationships can be society. It can be, when you're taking media, but these voices kind of like shape how we see ourselves and our roles in the world and what happens to us. And so postmodernists are really focused on that. And so they look at how all these pieces come together when they're working with their clients. And certainly at a certain point with this example, right, you might bring in the professional perspective on victim blaming around sexual assault, but it's not going to be where you're going to start. You're going to start by understanding their particular threads of meaning that are feeding their unique sense of self-blame is where you're going to start. And then you take the psychoeducation, it's like a little puzzle piece that might fit in with their unique construction of their experience. And so that way, when we do offer something to our clients, we always do it within their meaning-making structure rather than making a ton of assumptions based on a dominant cultural norm. Multiple realities, if you start doing couple work, for sure, often with families, but almost always with couples, there are like literally different realities that each partner often comes in with. And so that's a very common experience. Do not waste time necessarily like putting them together. I have learned to like, whoo, boy, I don't know. Is that really the same party you went to? Do you guys really go to the same thing? But there is this understanding that the realities are so different that like, you often can't get the timelines to line up in the beginning of treatment. So, but understanding that their unique experience is layered by a lot of societal, community, family of origin type of things that are shaping how they see the events that are unfolding, and really working with these realities rather than trying to find the objective truth between them, honoring that there really can be two very different realities in the same room. They think of self in a very different way than we typically do in mental health, rather than, the humanistic therapies really talk a lot about an authentic self. In postmodernism, they talk about a relational self, and that the self is really a social construct. And they oftentimes there are multiple selves that we have. We might have the who we are at work, who we are with our family of origin, who we are with our partner or our kids, or there are these different selves that are shaped by each context and each relationship that we are a part of. And it may not be a problem it may be a problem, but it may not be a problem. And it's just realizing that who we are, how we interact, what's authentic in one context may not be authentic in another. And so really just trying to understand a person's experience of identity and to help them construct identities that really help them to thrive, and most importantly, have a sense of agency where they feel like they can influence what is going on in their life. They talk a lot about culture, and John Schotter is a postmodern thinker more than a therapist, and talks about culture in a very interesting way. And they talk about that humans have created cultural norms, cultural rules. So this is a system. They don't use the term system, but it is a system if you think systemically. That culture is something, is a system of shared meanings that we need to organize our joint behavior. If we didn't know when you're greeting someone, whether they're friendly or not, we have these signals of a handshake or raising your hand. Different cultures have different symbols, right? Or interaction patterns that they use to signal, I'm safe, I'm friendly. So culture is necessary to coordinate meaning. And if you can't coordinate meaning, you cannot coordinate social action. Everyone's just lost and disorganized, right? There is no way to know what's safe, what's not safe, how we're going to get food, how do we do shelter, how do we connect, and relate with one another. There has to be some cultural context, some set of meanings that are arbitrarily kind of agreed upon to organize our behavior. And so, every culture on the planet has grown up, has evolved with its own unique sense of shared meanings to organize their behavior. This is how we date in this culture. This is what work is. This is how we live. This is, where we live, how we have shelter, how we get food. This is how we signal safety. This is how we signal conflict, right? All of that, there are cultural things. And if we didn't have these, we could not get along. Society could not evolve. So the problem is that every culture on the planet, every culture there ever has been, every culture there ever will be, has to limit certain behaviors and say, this is good and safe. This is the signal for safety. We're friends. This is the signal for danger. We are not friends. This is not friendly behavior. And so that can vary widely across different cultures, including like how far to stand apart from someone, right? So So certain behaviors get oppressed in every culture to some degree. So to a certain extent, oppression, oppressing certain behaviors is part of every culture, whether when you're in it, you don't see it because this is what's nice. This is the good behavior. That's the bad behavior. And so the key is, right, how do we make humane cultures? And so the key really is, how does a given culture treat dissenting voices? And so the more a culture is able to create mechanisms that allow dissenting voices to be heard respectfully in a safe way, the more humane that culture is. The more a culture simply shuts down dissenting voices or voices that are different, the more inhumane that culture is. So typically you would describe authoritarian governments as having very little freedom or safety for dissenting voices. They are often very harshly silenced, is what we would call an authoritarian, totalitarian type of government. Where a culture that leans more in a democratic system is going to have spaces, formal spaces even, right? The minority voices in a Congress, but they're formalized and they're allowed to be heard. And it creates a more humane system, more humane culture. Is it perfect? Never. And arguably, all we can do is try to make our systems more humane, try to include as many dissenting voices or voices that are different and other, and find ways. And it's going to create an increasingly complex system in order to become a more humane system. And so they talk a lot about dominant discourses and marginalized voices. So dominant discourses are kind of the loudest voice in a given culture, who has the most influence on what behaviors are considered good or okay and which ones are not. When the marginalized voices are the ones that don't, experience or who have a different sense of norms. So you can have, for example, in many societies, the male voices are have control over the dominant discourses, and female voices are marginalized. Their experience is marginalized. So if you look at many forms of history around the globe, it's a lot about what the men were working on, a lot less about what the women were doing. And when you read history, so then this happens in multiple different ways, these grand narratives, and then kind of marginalized voices within any culture. And every culture has marginalized voices. And most of us align with some of the dominant discourses in our world, in our lives, and have other parts of us that are marginalized or our experiences are marginalized. And so the challenge really is to create increasingly kind of humane cultures where all the voices can be heard and respected, and finding ways to invite these voices in that have been historically marginalized in whatever group that you're a part of. And this is never even steady. So, I live in the United States, certainly have male voices typically are setting the tone to the dominant discourse. But I teach for my career, I've taught in graduate programs, right, that are often master's level graduate programs in marriage, family therapy, and counseling, tend to be 80 to 90% females, right? So all of a sudden, many of the males in our program finally find themselves in this flip where female voices are quite dominant in these programs rather than male voices. And so even one person can have multiple different experiences around being marginalized, even around a single facet of identity. And so, what postmodern therapists are very conscious of is knowing that where a person experiences marginalization, which may not even always be obvious on the surface, you don't always know. It can be within their family of origin. Like I said, it can be within their grad program, flip some of the rules on them. But making sure that these marginalized voices we're able to give voice to them, able to respect them, and find ways to bring them into the discourse, into the dialogue, into how we're thinking about problems and solutions in a way that moves things forward. And so learning how to make space for these marginalized voices is very much something that postmodern therapists will do. You'll also notice they often don't even try to force a single narrative. They allow these multiple contradictory perspectives to actually linger in the air during a family session. This is what, let's say dad thinks a problem is. This is what mom thinks a problem is. This is what grandma thinks a problem is. This is what, the oldest daughter and the youngest son might think the problem is. And they will allow all of those voices to hang in the air rather than quickly push towards consensus, because they know each person, if you respect each voice, you allow it to hang in the air, that people are going to kind of make their own meanings from this and begin to shift how they see things in a way that isn't forced by the clinician. So there's a lot of work they do on that end in postmodern approaches. So I'm going to wrap up here just by talking about the postmodern spirit. And so from a postmodern perspective, there is this real curiosity, a humility, where realizing that what we are doing is we are constructing meaning together here. I'm constructing a reality here, and that I'm going to do it with this client together in a way that creates the most agency for this person. And there's this real fluidity to meaning. They realize that language and meaning is very, very fluid, and they allow for it to work with that fluidity rather than trying to label people and put them in a box, check a box, get the, standardized treatment plan and da. Rather than trying to organize and categorize people, they're allowing this flow to go back and forth to understand what or kind of organically makes sense to this client and works for this client. And so the one thing you will notice when you watch postmodern clinicians work, they are just masters in hope, optimism, possibility, strengths. And, they realize that, anything that is a problem or a weakness in one context is a strength in another. And there's this real kind of polarity going on with humanity, right? So, someone who's highly organized might do really great in school, but they might struggle in some of the social contexts that aren't as organized, that are more fluid or organic. So, for example, an extroverted person can be great at socializing, networking, building connection. But boy, if I want to have someone who is going to negotiate, a better, car deal for me, I want it to, an introvert is going to be much better at strategically knowing how to say things, not saying too much, So when something's much more sensitive, very legalistic, or you're trying to be strategic in your talking, an introvert's always going to do a better job there. So no matter what you have, and like worry, people who have anxiety or worry a lot, right? That weighs them down. But in another context, they're exactly who you want to plan your next vacation or your next party, because you're so good at anticipating potential problems and solving them before they happen. So postmodernists also have this very kind of flexible way of looking at things and understanding how we have so much power really to influence our reality by how we see it, how we define things, how we use language together to create new realities. So there is this real hopeful spirit that you will find with postmodernists in terms of how they approach their work. And so I find a lot of people are attracted to postmodern approaches, but really struggle at implementing them because there isn't enough of this postmodern shift, this postmodern spirit. And it is something where I think you really do need to get some in-depth training and kind of hanging out how to think and work this way. It's certainly not something you're going to learn from a book, I would say. So I think a lot of the concepts people really resonate with in the 21st century, but learning to do this work, I highly recommend you get some, skilled training in how to use that language and develop. It's almost like this way of seeing how we are constantly constructing reality with everyone around us, and how we can use whatever is going on as a potential resource for whatever our struggles are. So they're very good at being able to identify strengths when other people would really struggle to do so. Okay. Very, very good. So let's see here. If you happen to be here live, I'm going to go ahead and take some of these questions. It looks like the questions I'm getting really are coming from the let's see, the portion of this recording that was for the systemic theories. So Catherine's asking, can you say more about the word command functions and report and command? So the command is kind of commanding the person. The command is this idea of this is how you should be interpreting this comment and what that says about our relationship ultimately. And so the command function is usually what couples are arguing about. And usually it's because either they're hearing in that some kind of disrespect, quite honestly, or not valuing what a person's the other partner's contribution is. And so the command is the meta communication where you're typically what you're arguing about with a couple is you're hearing something that is defining the relationship in such a way that the other person is saying you're not correct or you're not valued. It might be also what they're hearing. There's another question here asking for examples of complementary and symmetrical relationships. Complementary relationships have divided kind of roles, and so they are more stable, but they risk being rigid. So an example, the breadwinner and the homemaker is one, the emotional person and the logical one, the good parent, the bad parent, the good kid, the bad kid. These are complementary relationships that you would see in a family system typically, or couple systems. And, they can be stable, but they can, when they become rigid, they become much more problematic. So there are a lot of couples who have decided that we are going to, we're going to divide and conquer. You're the disciplinarian and I'm the nice nurturing parent, which it can work, but it is not ideal. I always tell those couples that we want you to try to, I want both parents to have some of the nurturing and some of the disciplinarian. That said, traditionally it is a stable parenting system, but it's very fragile. And oftentimes it can create unhealthy triangles and alliances in a family. So we're symmetrical relationships where we're striving more for equality. These tend to escalate more. So there's going to be more arguing. So couples who are striving for egalitarianism, they argue more. It's part of the price of that, of not having everything is negotiable. Who's doing what? You can have a lot more escalation in those types of systems. So that's a good example there, I think, of the complementary relationships and symmetrical relationships. And so I think with couples is where I would use those distinctions the most, and just kind of understanding the nature of their conflict is very different in each type of relationship. And you're always looking to see, whatever it is in family systems work, there isn't one family system that necessarily is perfect and the best. There's a whole range of ways of being in a family that can be healthy. So we have a question here about how systemic therapists support a client who exists within an oppressive or abusive family. So what they would be doing, you'd be looking at the exact nature of how the abuse happens. Obviously, if there's child abuse going on, you're going to step in, and take whatever legal action needs to happen. But then you're looking at the whole system to see what the heck is going on. For example, if you have a system where the father is sexually abusing the daughter, you're going to not just focus on the father and his behavior, but you're going to look at what is the mother doing in the system? What are the other kids doing in the system? What's the extended family doing in this system? You're going to look at all of those dynamics and who's reinforcing what and how to determine how to create safety and whether even safety is possible, right? So that is, so you're always looking at all of those dynamics and understanding how meaning gets made in the system, how these norms get created, how they are reinforced. And there are times where you can have family systems where it's not treatable with the abuse, and there are other circumstances where it's theoretically possible it could be, right? But you have to assess all of this. So you're always looking at the system and its interaction patterns, right? So systems theory gives you the tools to do that more efficiently, but obviously there are moral and ethical issues and legal issues that come into play that we as clinicians need to be considering. But certainly if you have a family where there is abuse going on, the framework of systems helps you better understand what's going on and how to intervene, whether safety, how to create safety, and if possible, how to protect people. You need to understand those systemic dynamics because it's often much more complex than it may look. It's very tempting to just blame the one person. It doesn't necessarily mean the non-offending parent is actually safe. And I've had situations where my clients come to realize that the non-offending person was actually was the most psychologically abusive in the whole system. So you have to use this to analyze at a deeper level. So we have a question here about what the humanistic cultures are in crisis right now, and that we are seeing a rise of totalitarian, authoritarian governments around the world in many different cultures, right? And so the authoritarianism is often looking for simple answers to complex problems. So, every complex issue has many clear, simple, wrong answers. And that is part of the human condition. And I think the role that we have to play as mental health professionals, which is the end of Martin's set of questions here, is we have to be able to do what they call the both and in systemic work. We have to be able to see both sides, both realities, and to help people step out of the divisiveness. What has happened, what most people hypothesize is social media allowed us to get siloed, where we just get news from people who think like us. We just talk to people who think like us. And so we get so convinced that we have the objective truth and all those other people who don't think like us are wrong, and all of us are doing it. It is a very easy thing to fall into, because that is this ability to embrace the complexity of, these very diverse social systems that we are seeing around the globe right now. It's a much more psychologically and emotionally complex task, right? And so those totalitarian, that desire for totalitarianism is trying to get, okay, I want one clear set of rules that we're all supposed to use in society right now, right? Because you can't organize a culture without having a set of goods and shoulds that everyone's organizing their behavior with. And so there is the need, and what we can do, I think, as clinicians, in helping people to understand people who think very differently. And this is for all sides of political spectrums, creating that tolerance. But it is not natural human psychology to be tolerant as much as we think we might be. So we have a question here going on about how do you distinguish which therapy model is helping with systems? I would say systemic approaches tend to be what we would call strategic systemic therapies, structural. Bowen family systems are intergenerational, but it's still got a systemic core to it. You will see that Virginia Satir has a systemic experiential one. Carl Whitaker had a symbolic experiential, another kind of humanistic experiential approach. There is a systemic form of cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral couple or family therapy, which is always looking at how the family is reinforcing each other's behaviors. So awesome. Very good. So, okay. So these lectures, I think I'm going to post them as 2 separate lectures because they're quite long. Will be posted on YouTube. So that is where you will be getting them. And I can see here there's the PowerPoints will definitely be in my Laugh Your Way to Licensure course if you end up taking that for MFT licensure. And we will see if there's a way to get this to those who registered to get a copy of this in another way, because you cannot do that on YouTube. So awesome. Very good. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. I hope this was a useful introduction. Be well and take care. Bye-bye.